Now that I've completed my very long-winded discussion of the Buddha's life, I want to look at the tradition of Buddhist art in India in more depth. And sorry, this one is going to be long-winded too. We will discover as we explore the early art of Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity that all of these religious traditions expanded at a time when traditional society was in some way being transformed or even breaking down. In northwest India, at the time of the Buddha's birth in the 6th century BCE, increasingly powerful kingdoms were accumulating wealth and power, and society was increasingly stratified or divided along economic and caste lines. So the lives of ordinary people were coming under more and more strain, and the traditional religion was just not meeting their needs. One response among the traditional Hindu Brahmins, and I'm sorry, but we're really not going into Hinduism, I regret that, but one of the responses was solitary asceticism. This means that men seeking spiritual enlightenment and escape from samsara took up a life living alone as hermits in the woods, living very simply. Another response to these difficult times was adopted by shramanas, or wandering mendicants. That term means beggars. They came from castes other than the Brahmins, but they too were seeking liberation from samsara by leaving society. However, their chosen spiritual path was not solitary. They lived together in the forest with no caste differences as a spiritual community, or a sangha. The term sangha would be adopted by Buddhists for communities of monks and nuns. The sum of the teachings of the Buddha was Dharma, or the law, which is usually represented as a wheel. The Dharma chakra, or circle of Dharma, is probably the best known symbol of Buddhism and shows up repeatedly in Buddhist iconography. Its overall shape is that of a circle, or a chakra, representing the perfection of Dharma teaching. A circle was perfection in Buddhist thought. The hub stands for discipline, which is the essential core of meditation. The rim, which holds the spokes, refers to mindfulness or self-awareness, that you should be very conscious of everything you do. And then each spoke represents a portion of the Noble Eightfold Path. I'm about to list these, but do not try to write them all down. You don't need to know this. But the 8 correct practices were right beliefs, aspirations or hopes, speech, conduct, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, meditational attainment. In other words, this was about right living. The Dharma chakra is associated with one of the many mudras, or symbolic hand gestures, and these again show up all over in Buddhist art. Here you see a Buddha statue illustrating the Dharma chakra mudra. This mudra is associated with the Buddha's first sermon or teaching. There are a number of mudras, and we're going to see others as we look at Buddha images. If you're going to use a Buddha image in an AP art history essay, you probably want to know which mudra the Buddha is expressing. So here are a few more. The enlightenment or witness mudra shows Buddha pointing to the earth. You may remember the story. This represents the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment when the demon Mara attacked him with armies of monsters. He asked the about-to-be Buddha, "Where are your witnesses?" And Siddhartha responded by reaching out his right hand to touch the earth. And then the earth itself roared, "I bear you witness." Mara disappeared, and at this moment Siddhartha realized enlightenment and became a Buddha. By the way, I know a lot of the material in these lectures is repetitive. That's actually deliberate. If and when you write about Buddhist images, you want to include a discussion of both Buddhist beliefs and the life of the Buddha, which is very closely related to those beliefs. I'm assuming you're not very familiar with Buddhism, so I'm trying to reinforce some of these points. Anyway, to continue with the mudras, the no fear mudra conveys protection and security, and it remains very popular for Buddha images that are placed in the home. And you all know what meditation is, right? It remains at the heart of Buddhist religious practice. Just as Christianity got a big boost from the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, We'll hear more about that in the next unit. Buddhism began to spread dramatically when the great Mauryan ruler, Mauryan Empire was one of India's great early empires, so this ruler, King Ashoka, converted to Buddhism after he was just filled with horror and sorrow when he saw how much death and suffering one of his own military victories had caused. After converting to Buddhism, he drew up a new legal code based on the Dharma, and he inscribed these laws on monolithic stone columns placed throughout his empire. This is really like the stele of Hammurabi in many ways. This photo doesn't do justice to the lion capital. It stands 7 feet tall, and it was placed at Sarnath, where Buddha first preached about Dharma. There's a famous temple there as well, which we're not, alas, looking at. The column holding the capital penetrated deep into the ground, so it was meant to connect the earth and sky and form an axis of the universe. So what Buddhist iconography do you recognize right away? Well, I trust you all noticed the wheel or Dhammachakra. Ashoka took the name holder of the wheel for himself. The 4 lions likewise represent the 4 corners of the world, and the original statue had a wheel on the back of the lions as well. So what would you guess is an additional significance of the lions? Well, as in other Near Eastern culture, they symbolize strength and fierceness, the power of the king. So this work carried both a political and religious message, and as in many cultures, one reinforced the others. Below the lion, there's a frieze carrying sculptures in high relief of an elephant, a galloping horse, a bull, and a lion, separated by intervening spoked chariot wheels. The whole sculpture sits upon a bell-shaped lotus. You can probably guess the political symbolism of the animals and, of course, the wheel. But what about the lotus flower? What does it mean? In fact, it was an important Buddhist symbol, and one that I think is really quite interesting. The lotus plant grew in mud and muck. It was basically a swamp flower, and yet this plant produced a beautiful flower. And this, in Buddhist thinking, symbolizes the power of Dharma to create beauty, even in a troubled world. The lion capital, by the way, is now the symbol of India, and it appears on its currency. Ashoka founded a number of important monasteries, and one of the greatest was at Sanchi in central India. The monastery complex included a number of buildings. We'll see this in a moment. But the most famous is the Great Stupa. While the stupas were probably modeled on earlier South Asian burial mounds, they are not tombs, but reliquaries. Know that term. Built to house bits of the Buddha's body collected after his cremation. When the Buddha died, his remains were first collected in 8 reliquaries, but Ashoka sent relics to thousands of stupas all around his kingdom. These became important pilgrimage sites, and yes, a stupa would be an excellent non-Western example to use for a question on pilgrimage, and those show up quite frequently in the cultural context questions. The Buddha's ashes were thought to have spiritual power, so by visiting and worshiping these relics, Buddhists would participate in the Buddha's enlightenment. You're going to see several clips from an Asian Art Museum video on South Asian Buddhist art. Here's the first on the Great Stupa. This is a must-know work, one that would prove useful on a number of different cultural context essay questions. You're going to be writing another long essay this unit, this time on sacred spaces, and one of the 2 paragraphs, one of the 2 works, must be the Great Stupa at Sanchi. So stay tuned, pay attention, watch the video closely, and take notes. The circular building in this map is, of course, the stupa, but this gives you a better sense of how it belonged to a larger complex, including other stupas and numerous monastery buildings. The main body of the stupa, the dome or anda, represents the world mountain, which rises through the center of the Buddhist universe. The yasti, which rises through the top of the anda, symbolizes the axis mundi, the point at the center of the universe that connects heaven and earth. And notice that Buddhist symbols are very oriented toward maps and geographic symbols. Some traditions of Buddhism, by the way, also hold that the yasti represents the Bodhi tree, the tree under which the Buddha first found enlightenment. The 3 stone discs on the yasti are the 3 jewels of Buddhism: the Buddha himself, that is the life of Siddhartha, the Dharma or the law, and finally the Sangha or the monastic community. The yasti is surrounded by a small fence. See that up on top of the dome? That's called the harmika. I may be pronouncing some of these words wrong, by the way. In Buddhist tradition, fences are used as to gate off sacred areas. You remember how exclusivity is one of the features of sacred spaces? These multi-level fences accentuate the separateness of the sacred space from regular worldly concerns. Pass through the gate and you enter sanctified space. The part of the stupa surrounded by the harmika is a square area that represents the domain of the gods. And finally, down below in the fence that surrounds the stupa, there are 4 gateways leading into the stupa. These gateways are called toranas, and they are aligned with the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. Remember how the pyramids are aligned? It's very common for sacred spaces to be very carefully aligned with the sun. Passing through the gates, again, symbolizes entry into a spiritual world. The stupa was likewise, again, we're returning to sacred spaces, a site of ritual. Buddhists venerated the Buddha's remains, and they expressed this veneration through the ceremony of circumnavigation, walking around the stupa in a clockwise direction, again, following the path of the sun and creating harmony with the cosmos. The procession is also a communal act. Think of the procession depicted on the Parthenon. By the way, we're going to encounter circumnavigation and processions again when we get to Islamic mosques, and we'll see processions of a sort like this when we get to going around the apse of Romanesque churches looking at the remains or relics of saints. So keep that term circumnavigation in mind. Sorry, I should have built that slide earlier. Here we go. Here's a diagram of the stupa with those confusing terms spelled out. As your textbook explains, the stupa was actually a kind of map of the universe, also called a mandala. So again, we see all the elements of a sacred space. Quick review. The harmika, upper fence, and the torana gates mark off the exclusive sacred territory. Circumnavigation provided the ritual. Stupas were also richly decorated and often held treasures or offerings. Building a stupa brought the donor good karma. Finally, stupas were often built at places of great spiritual significance. Although the Buddha himself never visited Sanchi, it was the burial place of one of his leading disciples. The great stupa is surrounded, as we saw, by smaller stupas that contain the relics of Buddha's disciples. Here we see a better look at one of the gateways opening to the 4 cardinal directions through which the spiritual energy flows throughout the world. The gateway to the stupa is covered with friezes that depict stories from the Buddha's life and also from his past lives. The Buddha is represented by symbols: the lotus, the wheel, a riderless horse, an umbrella held above a throne, footprints, and 3 jewels, which are symbolic of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. These toranas were carved the century after Ashoka's reign, but they still predate the period where Buddha was represented as a human figure. At this point, that was considered sacrilegious, but it's about to change. Here's a larger photo of the circular walkway. As worshippers passed through the east gate, they circled the stupa clockwise again. You've seen the mandala before, but now you should be able to see the parallel with the hemispheric or circular construction of the stupa. This work, by the way, is Tibetan, not Indian. You also saw this on the video. One of the carved figures on the torana is a yakshi, an Indian goddess who represented fertility and agriculture. Buddhists basically reinvented her, just as Christians would reinvent many pagan symbols in a variety of cultures. So now she represents the Buddha's mother, Mara. Again, we see Hinduism reinterpreted, but also the way in which Hinduism and Buddhism coexisted, at least at this point in India. The woman and tree motif carried an added dimension of meaning due to a widely prevalent ancient belief that by her touch, a woman could cause a tree to blossom or bear fruit. When we get to Islam, by the way, we'll also see that religion expropriating, borrowing from earlier traditions to add significance to places of worship. Also notice here the comfort with sensuality in Indian religious art, both Buddhist and Hindu. Buddhism, like Hinduism, regarded sexuality and spirituality as really variant forms of a single fundamental cosmic force. And this is a contrast with Christianity, which especially in the Middle Ages was associated with a distrust of sensuality and a preference for monastic celibacy, that is, having no sexual relations. An outstanding feature of the narratives of the Great Stupa is how they express events in everyday life. So here we see processions watched by people on balconies, happy scenes of music and dance, villages where women are pounding grain and fetching water, and forests where elephants are bathing in lotus ponds while monkeys and geese frolic on the banks. In the midst of all these apparently everyday surroundings, the Buddha is present, although of course not yet as an image. So the processions and dances are in honor of his relic, the village is where he performed one of his miracles, the forest is the setting for a tale of his previous life. In unfolding the story of the Buddha or the truths of Buddhism, artists framed these stories in the world of the familiar. But again, the Buddha is not yet being shown as an image. Still another Buddhist sacred space was the Chaitya Hall, a rock-cut temple that also contained ambulatories for circumambulating a stupa. It's hard for a photo to capture these spaces adequately, so take a break again from my disembodied voice and watch a second clip from the video on Buddhist art. And here you see a photo and plan of the Chaitya Hall in Karli, India. Notice the apse or circular alcove. You'll see these in Christian churches as well. And these house a small stupa and also an ambulatory, that is a circular area for circumambulation. We'll see those terms again when we get to Romanesque cathedrals. And now finally, we're going to move to images of the Buddha, which is probably what most of you think of when you think of Buddhist art. First, watch this introduction to Indian images of the Buddha, a continuation of the video we've been watching. Images of the Buddha himself did not appear, as you saw, for at least 400 years after his death. And even then, they were created only to remind followers of their own innate Buddha nature. Eventually, these evolve almost into a kind of idol worshipped. But this is the meditating Buddha from Gandhara. Now, you saw images from Gandhara in my introductory lecture on the life of Buddha. Here's a little more background. Gandhara was located in the region of present-day northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, which was part of what was called the Kushan Empire. So we've moved from the Mauryan Empire to the Kushan Empire. It was located near overland trade routes and had links to ports on the Arabian Sea, and therefore, even to ancient Rome and to Persia. Its art tended to incorporate elements from India, from Persia, and from Greco-Roman styles that were brought to Central Asia by Alexander the Great. So you can see some of this stylistic influence in the facial features, in the curly hair, and in the classical style of the drapery or the costumes. Images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas from Gandhara somewhat resemble sculptures of Apollo, Athena, and other Greco-Roman gods. By the way, I'll talk about Bodhisattvas in a minute in case you're feeling confused. On the other hand, Buddhist sculptural drapery tends to be more symmetrical and regular, in keeping with the serenity of the Buddha. No Nike of Samothrace flowing, billowing garments here. You also see some of the characteristic iconography. The halo is common in depictions of the Buddha. Sometimes it's shown as a circle of light, sometimes it's shown as a flame. Halos, by the way, appear in many cultures, including, of course, Christian art. The Ushnisha, or top knot, symbolizes his role as a spiritual guide for his followers. The Urna is a third eye, symbolizing the Buddha's ability to see into the divine world. The mudra, or hand gesture, you've encountered before, and this one is the meditation gesture. You should have all of these on your notes. And there you see a comparison with the drapery folds of Nike from a classical depiction from the Temple of Athena Nike. And here's a map of Gandhara. This area is now an epicenter of fighting, by the way, between different tribes in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and between Islamic extremists and forces seeking to contain them. As you might expect, much of this art has been imperiled. There was the famous destruction of Buddha statues in Bamiyan by the Afghani Taliban just a few months before they attacked New York City in 9/11. One of the earliest pictorial narratives in which the Buddha appears in human form again comes from these Gandharan friezes. And here you see the Buddha's birth, the enlightenment at Bodhigaya, the first sermon at Sarmath, the Buddha's death. You saw some of these earlier. This is just a reminder now that you know more about Gandhara and about the evolution of images of the Buddha. These sculptures, too, show classical influence, specifically some similarity to Roman sculptural friezes, including reclining figures similar to those found on Roman sarcophagi. Here's a Roman image for purposes of comparison. This is actually from the early Christian era. We'll encounter this sarcophagus in our next unit. This is a less busy slide, so you have a chance to see it more up close. The Buddha preaching his first sermon at Sarnath. You see the deer below him. The raised hand is the fear not mudra. Notice, too, the hierarchical composition with a central figure surrounded by disciples or followers. We're going to see a lot of this in Christian art. The Buddha in this statue from Mathura, contemporary with the Gandhara sculptures, shows a more sensuous and solid Buddha, dressed in almost transparent robes. The depiction is more closely related to the Hindu sculptural tradition. The Buddha is sitting under the Bodhi tree and has his hands raised once again in the fear not mudra. It's hard to see it from this slide, but the image of the Dharma wheel is carved into his feet and hands. This stylized Buddha with its established iconography and increasingly canonical proportions, those drawings on the left are the canons of depiction of the Buddha. Remember the canon of Polykleitos, the canons of Egyptian art, the rules about how portraits are done. You should also see the wheel turning mudra and the deer below the Gupta. This comes from the Gupta Empire, the 4th century CE. This period also produced standing Buddhas, which will be particularly typical of Southeast Asian Buddhist art. But more commonly, the Buddha is shown with his feet crossed in the lotus position. And there you see the deer down below, the wheel on its edge. We close with this painting of a bodhisattva from 5th century paintings in the cave chaitya hall that you saw in the video. Now, bodhisattvas are new entries into the Buddhist canon who will be especially important as Buddhism travels to China. I'm going to close here, or if you're running out of time, maybe open the next class with another short video clip that explains the bodhisattvas and then talks about the decline of Buddhism in India.